It really makes you stop and think. Back in the late 1800s, believe it or not, there were actually more child performers in America than at any other time.
Yeah, it's kind of wild.
And the kicker, these weren't just, cute kids singing songs. They were doing serious drama, even Shakespeare. It's just such a contrast to the image we have later on.
Right. And what's fascinating is how the movie industry, as it started, really changed things for these kids. That early period, it sort of sets the stage for this long, often really tough history.
Absolutely. Which brings us to what we're diving into today, the often, frankly, devastating experiences of child stars in movies and TV throughout Hollywood history. You hear child star, you probably think, oh, glamour premieres.
Right, the red carpets, the fame.
But the sources we looked at, they show a much, much darker side.
It's easy to get caught up in that shiny image. The whole entertainment world seems magical from the outside. But like you said, the Into the Shadows video transcript we looked at, among others, it paints a really different picture. The reality for so many was, well, challenging, sometimes deeply traumatic.
Yeah. So our goal today is to really try and unpack the systemic problems and also the personal tragedies that just keep cropping up for these young people, despite that glittering facade.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we should start with the early days, like the first attempts to regulate things and that key story of Jackie Coogan.
Definitely. Coogan is, he's really ground zero for this conversation. Silent film era, he becomes one of the first real child stars.
Yeah.
Huge star.
After The Kid with Chaplin, right?
Exactly. Launched them globally. And over the next decade or so, he reportedly earned something like $2 million, which today, that's like $37 million.
Oh, wow. That's life-changing money. You'd think he'd be set for life. But this is where it gets just, incredibly sad and unfair. He turns 21, ready to access his fortune, and finds out his mother and stepfather had basically spent it all.
It's shocking. Just shocking. And it perfectly shows how vulnerable these kids were financially back then. He did sue eventually, won in 1938, but got it back only a fraction, maybe, $250,000?
Yeah.
And half of that went to legal.
So this wasn't just some, one-off tragedy that shocked people and then faded away. It actually caused a change.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It directly led to the 1939 California Coogan Law.
The Coogan Law, right.
Exactly. Coogan's experience, the injustice of it, was the catalyst. The law was meant to stop that kind of blatant financial exploitation. It said, okay, a percentage of the kids' earnings has to go into a trust, a Coogan account. They can't touch it until they're 18.
Okay, so problem solved. Did that law actually protect child actors from then on?
Well, not completely. It was a huge step, no doubt. Really important. But it had, limitations built in.
Like what?
It only mandated a minimum of 15% had to go into that protected trust. 15.
Only 15%. So what happened to the other 85%?
Exactly. That massive chunk, 85%, was still basically unprotected unless someone voluntarily set up extra safeguards, which often didn't happen. So it left this huge loophole. And unfortunately, as the sources show, financial abuse, well, it kept happening. There just wasn't enough oversight on that bigger part of their income.
Wow. It's really disheartening. Even the first big attempt at protection left so much room for things to go wrong. Okay, so moving into Hollywood's golden age. We hear about Shirley Temple, right? She seems like she had this smooth, successful career. Was that typical?
Shirley Temple.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's often seen as kind of an outlier, an exception. Huge fame from age 3, retired from film by 22. Tons of movies.
And she transitioned successfully afterwards, didn't she? Public service.
Right. Became a U.S. ambassador, served on boards like Disney. Her story, compared to so many others, seems relatively unscathed by the usual pressures and problems of child stardom.
So she's really the exception that proves the rule then, because when you look at someone like Judy Garland, it's just a completely different and much more tragic story.
Oh, absolutely. Judy Garland's life is just a stark, painful contrast. Frances Gumm originally, performing on stage super young with her family.
But her home life wasn't stable, right? Even early on.
No. Marked by instability, her father's alleged affairs, the family moving to California partly because of that.
And her mother, Ethel, she really fits that intense stage mom image, doesn't she?
100%. Ethel Gumm is often called like the quintessential Hollywood stage mother, and her methods were, well, incredibly demanding and ultimately really damaging. By the time Judy was 10, she was already on a severe diet. And
amphetamines at 10.
Yeah, to keep her energy up for performing, and then sleeping pills at night to knock her out. It basically created this cycle of addiction before she was even a teenager.
That's just horrifying. And then she gets signed by MGM at 13, a huge studio, but the conditions sound awful, especially during the Depression.
Right. She was earning $100 a week, which is actually good money then. But the pressure about her weight was constant. The work schedule was grueling. Schooling for a few hours early morning, then long rehearsals, full days filming, sometimes juggling multiple movies at once. These kids were often just commodities. Their well-being wasn't the priority.
And it sounds like it got even worse during The Wizard of Oz. The pressure to look younger, smaller for Dorothy.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
The studio apparently wanted Shirley Temple first, right? So to make Garland, who was a teenager, fit that younger image, they put her on an even more extreme diet. Basically chicken soup and black coffee, plus the pills.
And the cigarettes? I read she was given cigarettes.
Yeah. Shocking, isn't it? Reportedly up to 80 cigarettes a day. Because smoking was sometimes pushed back then as a way to lose weight. It's just awful. And beyond the physical toll, she also allegedly faced constant harassment on set.
Yeah, the stories about some of the Munchkin actors and even the studio head, Louis B. Mayer, they're really disturbing.
Her third husband later wrote about sexual harassment from some of the actors playing Munchkin. And Mayer himself is alleged to have been, well, highly inappropriate and exploitative towards her. Then, when she was only 19, she got pregnant.
And she was pressured into an abortion?
Reportedly, yes.
Yeah.
By her parents and the studio. They were afraid it would ruin her public image, this wholesome image they'd built.
God, that's just an unbelievable amount of trauma for someone so young. And it seems like it just sent her down a terrible path.
Tragically, yeah. Her dependence on drugs, on alcohol, it just got deeper as she tried to cope with all that pressure, all that trauma. Her health, physical and mental, just deteriorated over her life. She died at 46, barbiturate overdose. Such a heartbreaking difference between the public image and her private reality. And her story, like our source points out, it sadly wasn't unique. Even then.
It really makes you think about all the lost potential. Look at Bobby Driscoll, discovered by Disney at 5, became a huge star, Song of the South, an Oscar at 12, the voice of Peter Pan. It sounds like a fairy tale.
On the surface, yeah, it does. But Driscoll's story takes a really dark. Howard Hughes bought RKO, which distributed Disney's films then.
And Hughes didn't like child actors.
Apparently not. He reportedly thought they were inauthentic, I guess. So Disney dropped Driscoll, a decision Walt Disney himself supposedly regretted later.
And that seemed to be the turning point for Driscoll, wasn't it? The start of a real downward spiral.
It really seems like it. He tried to transition, went to university, started a family, but he struggled. His personal life got messy, multiple marriages, divorces, and then tragically, heroin addiction took hold. He died completely unknown, basically, at just 31. He just highlights that cliff they fall off, The lack of support once the spotlight moves on.
It really does seem like a pattern. The transcript we looked at also mentions Dana Plato, David Cassidy, Gary Coleman, faces we all knew seemed so successful, but they faced such public, difficult struggles later. Let's talk about Gary Coleman for a minute. Different stroke.
Massive. Coleman was only 10, becomes this huge star, everyone knew his catchphrase, but his life, behind the scenes, was marked by really serious health problems from day one.
The kidney disease, right?
Yeah, congenital kidney disease diagnosed when he was just 2. Constant medical stuff, transplants, dialysis.
Right.
Which also stunted his growth, which became part of his image, ironically.
So even when he was at the peak of his fame as a kid, he was dealing with all that.
Exactly. And as different strokes went on, his happiness apparently just plummeted. Severe depression, reportedly even vomiting between scenes because he was so stressed and unhappy. When the show ended, he basically said he never wanted to act again, and then the financial stuff came out.
Over $1 million stolen by his parents, and then more lost to bad investments, after everything he'd been through.
Devastating. And despite trying comebacks, navigating difficult relationships, his life just stayed really tough. Continued health problems, and then he tragically died after a fall. Only 42. His story just shows all the different layers of difficulty these kids can face all at once.
The 80s seem to bring even more of these struggles out into the open, and the story of Judith Barsi, it's just absolutely chilling.
Judith Barsi, such a talented young voice actress. The Land Before Time, All Dogs Go to Heaven. But her home life was a nightmare. Her father was a violent alcoholic, abused both Judith and her mother constantly.
And there was that incident in the Bahamas. Where he threatened her life.
Deeply disturbing, yeah. And the authorities were actually alerted. Children's Services investigated.
But nothing happened. They didn't take her out of there.
Well, this is the really tragic part. They investigated, but apparently because there were no, visible physical marks on Judith at that time, they had closed the case, despite all the warning signs, the verbal threats, the emotional abuse. And the outcome was preventable tragedy. Her father shot both Judith and her mother, then killed himself. It's an unbelievably horrific example of the dangers some kids face right inside their own homes.
And then there's Rebecca Schaefer, a young actress killed by a stalker. It's terrifying how easy it was for him to get her address back then.
Schaefer's murder was another devastating tragedy. It did thankfully lead to some changes, stricter anti-stalking laws, more limits on getting info from GNV records. But as the source notes, stalking didn't just go away. It remained a serious problem for celebrities.
The 80s also gave us the Brat Pack, right? These teen idols, always in the news, often for being bad boys or wild. You have to wonder what was really going on under that surface.
Oh yeah, the Brat Pack. John Hughes's movies really fueled that whole thing, created these figures who seemed so glamorous, so rebellious. But behind that image of partying and, not caring, a lot of them were dealing with serious stuff. It makes you ask, did the intense fame, the lack of privacy at that age, plus the pressure to be that image, did it cause problems or just mask them?
Anthony Michael Hall, for instance, he admitted he was drinking heavily really young, though thankfully he got sober later. And Rob Lowe's been very open about his addictions back then, too.
And Robert Downey Jr., obviously. His struggles with addiction, prison time, it really shows the dark side behind that cool image. Molly Ringwald has also talked about sexual harassment she experienced as a child actress.
And Corey Haim and Corey Feldman, right. They both spoke about sexual abuse in the industry.
Yeah. Their stories really paint a picture of maybe widespread issues that just got ignored or glossed over by the media, which preferred the easier, cool kids narrative.
It's like their cries for help, if they were making them, just weren't heard, or maybe ignored deliberately. Then there's Drew Barrymore, famous almost from birth. Her story feels like early tragedy mixed with this incredible resilience, but still with scars.
Drew Barrymore's start was unbelievably early. An ad at 11 months, film debut at 5, then E.T. at 7, global superstardom.
Yeah.
Hosted at SNL at 7, youngest ever.
But her home life was a mess.
Completely unstable, violent alcoholic father. Her mother taking her to nightclubs when she was way too young, reportedly letting her drink.
So it's almost no surprise she started struggling with drugs and alcohol so early. Rehab before she was even a teenager. It's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, by 12, apparently using marijuana and cocaine.
Okay.
In rehab before 13. And then she took that huge step, emancipated herself from her parents at 13.
And she's had a great career since, but she's also been open about ongoing struggles with addiction sometimes.
Right. Which just shows how deep those early experiences can run. The impact can last a lifetime, even with later success.
Okay, moving into the 90s and 2000s, it seems like the public just wanted more and more young stars. And sadly, the same old problems kept surfacing. Macaulay Culkin Home Alone made him maybe the biggest child star ever and incredibly rich.
Oh, absolutely. Culkin's success was just astronomical. Earned like an estimated $50 million by the time he was 15. But the thing is, he apparently didn't even really know how much money he had. His father controlled everything very strictly.
So he took legal action. Not emancipation, but to protect his money.
Yeah, during his parents' really messy custody battle, he took steps to block them from controlling his finance. But yeah, not formal emancipation then.
And there were always those intense rumors about serious heroin.
There were definitely persistent rumors. He's talked about using drugs recreationally in the past, but it seems like maybe the addiction wasn't quite as severe or long-lasting as some reports made it sound. By all accounts today, he seems much more grounded, well-adjusted.
Edward Furlong, though?
Mm-hmm.
After Terminator 2, he seemed set for a huge career, but his path went very differently, very tough.
Yeah, Furlong's early success was quickly followed by that really concerning relationship with his much older on-set tutor, the family apparently trying to intervene. But yeah. And then came years of severe substance abuse, alcohol, cocaine, heroin, meth. Led to major health problems, lots of legal trouble. He has reportedly been working on recovery more recently, but it's clearly been a really long, hard road for him.
Lindsay Lohan was another massive star in the early 2000s, but that party girl image seemed to hide some serious...
Lohan, yeah, similar to Barrymore in some ways, started super young. Modeling, then The Parent Trap made her a star. Early 2000s hits, she was everywhere. But then came the very public struggles with addiction, multiple rehab stays, career setbacks.
But she seems to have turned things around recently.
Thankfully, yes.
Yeah.
Seems like she's sober, back acting again. It's good to see.
And then there's the really awful story of Jake Lloyd. His experience with Star Wars Episode 1, the backlash actually seemed to cause real trauma.
Oh, the criticism directed at Lloyd for playing young Anakin. It was relentless. And just brutal, honestly. For a kid, he faced terrible bullying at school because of it. Had no safe space, it sounds like.
And he just quit acting.
Yeah, he stepped away from Hollywood entirely because the harassment was just too much. And later, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Now, obviously, mental illness is complex, many factors involved, but it's hard not to wonder about the connection between that intense early trauma and his later struggles.
It's clear TV wasn't immune either. The Olsen twins seemed to navigate it okay, transitioned into business.
Right, they're another kind of exception, building their own empire.
But so many others, especially late 90s, early 2010s, big challenges. Demi Lovato, huge on Disney Channel, has been really open about their struggles.
Lovato's journey, yeah.
Yeah.
Battles with mental health, bipolar disorder, heavy drug use, cocaine, multiple rehab stays, that near-fatal overdose. But thankfully, they found sobriety and are now a huge advocate for mental health awareness.
Orlando Brown's story seems much darker, though. After Major Pain, Disney stuff like, that's so Raven, things went way off track.
Yeah, Brown's early promise just kind of disintegrated.
Yeah.
Numerous arrests for all sorts of things, increasingly strange public statements. His ongoing personal issues have really blocked any chance of a comeback, it seems.
And then we get to Nickelodeon. The recent revelations about what went on there are really disturbing. Amanda Bynes, Drake Bell. It raises serious questions.
Amanda Bynes, yeah. So successful early on stand-up, all that, The Amanda Show. Then she abruptly retired, followed by very public struggles, drugs, ecstasy, MDMA, Adderall, apparently, and serious mental health issues.
Legal problems, psychiatric hold.
Right. And a conservatorship for a while.
Yeah.
Even though that's ended, they're still concerned. And that documentary, Quiet on Set, it really exposed allegations of hostile, toxic, inappropriate environments at Nickelodeon back then.
Drake Bell's story in that doc about the sexual assault by a dialogue coach on set, it's just horrific, especially how the industry apparently reacted and the light sentence the guy got.
And his father had apparently warned people. Awful. Bell's experience just throws into sharp relief how vulnerable these kids are, how little protection they sometimes have, even when abuse is reported. The power dynamic, the potential for exploitation is just huge, and accountability can be minimal.
It really all comes down to a basic lack of strong systemic protection, doesn't it? There are some federal labor laws, but it sounds like there are massive gaps.
Huge gaps. Federal laws often don't cover the specifics of film and TV work very well, leaving it to states. And unbelievably, there are still 17 U.S. states with no specific rules for child entertainers. None.
17. Wow.
And even in states with rules for onset, what about offset? What about protection from abusive parent or controlling managers? There's often very little there.
And we keep circling back to the Coogan Law. Important first step, yes, but still only requires that minimum 15% is protected, leaving 85% potentially up for grabs.
Exactly. And if you think about it historically, it kind of mirrors how we used to think about child labor in other industries, right? Putting developing kids into these super demanding jobs, intense pressure, public scrutiny, huge financial stake, whether it's a factory back then or a film set now, it carries massive risks for their development, their well-being.
So yeah, it's clear, the history of child stardom. It's often so far from the glittering image we have. It's a history filled with exploitation, abuse in various forms, and trauma that lasts long after the cameras stop rolling.
And while sure, individual circumstances matter, the fact that these patterns keep repeating decade after decade points strongly towards bigger problems, systemic issues, inadequate protections that just consistently put these young performers in harm's way.
Which really brings us to a final thought, a question for you, the listener. Given these recurring, deeply troubling patterns we've seen over so many, what fundamental changes, maybe even radical ones, are still needed in the industry, in the regulations, to truly put the well-being and healthy development of child performers first, instead of just focusing so often on their, merchandising potential? It's definitely something we need